Good morning. It gets darker and darker, and then Jesus is born. That's something Rosie, I think, originally shared that with me when she was reading an Anne Lamott book years ago, and I love the simplicity of how it sums up Advent. And I learned since then it's actually Wendell Berry that said that to Anne Lamott. So it's an Anne Lamott quote from Wendell Berry at the start of the sermon. It's like a cheat code, PMC sermon cheat code. It gets darker and darker, and then Jesus is born. This is the arc of Advent. It is a wading into darkness. Not just a narrative arc, but something that happens literally and physically. We feel in our bodies, as Katerina was talking about even today, the shortening days and the longer nights. The changing seasons rhyme with the cycles we experience in our lives. Darkness does have a way of growing, doesn't it? But hope also finds a way in. Not like just a cheap plot twist, but like that moment when you remember that the days are no longer getting shorter. That realization just setting in right now. Light will break in again. Hope grows with it. A deeper current, a more foundational reality. It's the fourth Sunday of Advent, and it's been getting darker and darker as we wait for Jesus' arrival. We are reading what we read this week is the text with Zechariah's song. And I've been thinking about Zechariah's silence. Not just Zechariah, but in Luke, there's this silence, a broad sense of quiet behind and around the story. I've been thinking about how important it is to understand that silence, to understand Zechariah's song. It gets darker and darker, and then Jesus is born. Have you noticed, too, that this time of year it gets quieter and quieter? I mean, I know there's lots of noise and things that are happening, but I think about like childhood Advents when it would snow this time of year, and all of a sudden the whole world would be so still and quiet, sounds would be muffled. It felt like every sound could carry for miles. I notice it here too. People stay in more. The constant freeway hum, which I think of like, sometimes sounds like a river, just constantly flowing. It gets a little bit quieter. I was driving to pick Isley up last week in Santa Cruz, and I drove through the Central Valley, and there's that special tool fog they have in the Central Valley that happens when maybe especially when it's a little rainy and the ground is cold and it's a little warmer up above, and so you get this saturated air that just sits. It's a really thick fog that hangs around sometimes for days, and everything is so still and quiet. It's the things that happen this time of year. It gets darker and it gets quieter. Have you noticed any of those things this season? Before we get to Zechariah's song, we have Zechariah's silence. Remember from a couple of weeks ago in the first part of the story that Zechariah was called up as part of his group of priests to go to the temple, among thousands of other priests, because Zechariah was not the only priest. There were lots of priests that went up to serve their duties, and that's why it says, they drew lots. Zechariah drew the straw to go in as near as he would probably ever go to the place where God's presence was believed to dwell, right next to the entrance to the Holy of Holies, where the incense altar was. And it was his job on that day to offer the prayers of the people. And it was a dark time for the people. The prayers of the people, I imagine, must have been heavy, because Luke tells us right in the beginning of the story that these were the days of Herod, king of Judea, Herod the Great, who was called the king of the Jews, but really was a puppet king for the occupying Romans. The king who likely bought his way into power and used ruthless political maneuvering to be appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. That's who appointed Herod, far from the king from the line of David that the people had been waiting for. And even the Romans recognized how cruel he was. The Emperor Augustus reportedly said of Herod, "Better to be his pig than his son," because he was known to execute anyone who got in the way of his consolidation of power. But Herod knew too how to pander to his religious subjects. Herod managed an oppressive tax system, but he also used some of that money to significantly expand and build up the temple in Jerusalem. Herod sought to legitimize his reign by marrying a princess from the Hasmonean family, or the Maccabees, who were a priestly family who had led a revolt that helped them regain control of Judea. So even his marriage was this kind of strategic alliance before he killed that wife too, when she became, not useful to his consolidation of power or his messaging to the people. So everything for Herod was about connecting himself as a symbol of Jewish independence and religious authority. Now, we have to really, sometimes like the biblical times are so different, we have to really stretch our imagination to imagine, political leaders who would pander to the religious majority to secure their political power. But just, if you can really stretch your mind, imagine this scenario and the kind of hopelessness and despair that comes with that. I mean, some people may have bought that, but I'm sure some felt that dissonance. God's quiet beneath the noise of the banging and hammering of Herod's temple makeover. Imagine then what the prayers of the people Zechariah offered in the temple may have been. God, why are you silent? Why would you let this happen? Send us the promised deliverance. When will you show up? And since Zechariah was there, and this is probably as close as he would ever get to, at the altar of incense, right there next to the Holy of Holies, maybe he snuck in a prayer for himself too. God, don't forget about me and Elizabeth. It would have been typical for the priest to come out of the temple after the hour of incense and offer a blessing. And note here, that's the song that we read this morning is called the blessing, the Benedictus. Remember how it starts, blessed be the Lord God of Israel. He has visited and redeemed his people as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old. So in other words, the blessing comes, but it's delayed. It doesn't come at the temple in front of the waiting crowd because Gabriel silenced Zechariah. So he comes out and all he can do is gesture, whatever he's trying to tell the people, I don't know. And the people are kind of like, they think, well, something must have happened, but they're not sure what happened either. And we mostly hear about Zechariah's silence as a punishment. He responded to Gabriel's announcement by asking, how will this be? Which is not an okay question to ask an angel, so he was punished. Actually, that's what Mary asked the angel, which I guess was an okay question. I'm just pointing out a little disparity there. Zechariah responded, how will I know this? Which apparently was not the okay question. So how will this be? They both had a question. Now, I'm not here to be a Zechariah apologist. I'll note that Gabriel does say it's on account of Zechariah's unbelief that he will be silent. But I want to suggest that the silence serves a purpose that goes beyond something punitive. And maybe that's just semantics, like we used to say to the kids, like, it's not a punishment, it's a consequence. But I want to go even further to say that maybe the silence was something of a grace. The silence itself is part of Zechariah preparing the way. This is like the path of gelassenheit, as we've been talking about in this series. A way of release to align with God's unfolding desire and plan. So I've been thinking about the posture of gelassenheit. This yieldedness, willing surrender, acceptance, release of control, letting go. This spiritual posture is so well embodied in the physical practice of silence and stillness. If I had the opportunity to offer my own contribution to Meister Eckhart's made-up German word, gelassenheit, I might suggest that he smush on the front of the German word for the German word for silence, which is stille. So it could be stillassenheit. It's got a nice ring to it, right? I don't know what kind of person Meister Eckhart was if he was accepting suggestions. If we can imagine the silence as more than punishment, we might hear it less as a vindictive and booming, Zechariah, you have not believed, and therefore you will not be able to speak. and more of a hush, like a shh. You're asking, how will I know this? Just shh. You'll know. There are two things that I've been thinking that this yieldedness and silence provides that may be helpful in some way for us to think about. The first is that the silence of Zechariah provides space in which other voices emerge. Just like our sound people can control the service from the mixing board, you may not know the power that's held back there. They can quiet some voices, they can bring up the volume on others. In this story, the voice of the man, the priest, the one who symbolically seems like the likely one to lead the way in priest-splaining, it's another made-up word of mine, what God is up to, that voice is turned down. And in its place, other voices can be turned up, right? So Elizabeth, we haven't heard voices like Elizabeth, we turn that voice up. Mary, we haven't heard a voice like Mary's. Bring Zechariah down, let's turn Mary's voice up. We miss out on the voices without Zechariah's silence. I think this is instructive on how gelassenheit should be practiced in community. The call to yieldedness comes first to the ones who traditionally hold more positions of power. And not just for the sake of their release from responsibility and engagement, because I think silence can be kind of another way to yield or to hold power, right? If we just sit back and we say like, well, fine, I won't say anything. But it's actually so that they can help hold that space so that now new voices can emerge. The balance is delicate because I think there is a need for all voices in a community, but I just noticed that this time of silence for Zechariah means that when he does speak, his perspective is enriched by what he has been hearing. Think of him as watching and listening to the interpretation and understanding of Mary and Elizabeth, so that when they look to him in this kind of surprisingly patriarchal turn in the story, when they're naming the baby, and they don't believe Elizabeth, and so they turn to the dad, like I think of like the camera going to different people in this story. They turn to the dad expecting him to say like, no, actually it's going to be Zechariah Jr. But no, before he can even speak, he writes and points back to Elizabeth and says she's right. His name is John. John, the name that means God is gracious. Again, it may have been a forced silence. It's not something that Zechariah chose, but there was a grace in the posture Zechariah took for those months. And when it was his time to sing, he was filled with the Holy Spirit, and his blessing wasn't just for the people in front of the temple waiting for the blessing, but the blessing became part of redemption history. The second thing that yieldedness and silence, gelassenheit, what do you think? Promise the last time I'll say it. The second thing that silence gives us is it provides us the move from reactiveness to responsiveness. It's a small distinction that I think deserves our attention. We live in a world of constant reaction. Even as we talked about the outward growing signs of quiet in this season, I also recognize that we are bombarded with noise, with demands that can make the internal experience of Advent anything but quiet. It's easy to just react, to lurch from one thing to the next, to fill every empty space with more noise, more activity, more stuff. One of the reflections from the teaching team, as we were first talking about gelassenheit, is how yieldedness can feel like it is in tension with the parallel spiritual practice of resistance. Advent invites us to hold this tension in contemplation, to truly see what's in front of us, to respond with intention, with love, with grace. To do that, we need silence. We need to cultivate that inner stillness. Richard Rohr says, to live in this primordial foundational being, which I'm calling silence, creates a kind of sympathetic resonance with what is right in front of us. Without it, we are just reaching, we are just reacting instead of responding. So there's that difference between reacting and responding. The opposite of contemplation, he says, is not action, it is reaction. We must wait for pure action, which always proceeds from a contemplative silence. So the opposite of contemplation is not action, it is reaction. It just really struck me, and I know Richard Rohr has the Center for Contemplation and Action, and thinking about how those two things go together. It would be the wrong takeaway to hear today, we all just need to shut up. And that's what Zechariah teaches us, and that's what gelassenheit means. Just be quiet. For some of us, it may mean that you need to speak out more. Maybe you have been waiting in silence, and the space that is held is yours for your voice to enter into. For all of us, I think it means we are invited to receive the grace of stillness. It may feel like a punishment. It's certainly how it was construed in Zechariah's case. Real deep stillness is difficult. In that posture, though, our hope is that we find something at least close to pure action. We can name a thing rightly and find ourselves in the middle of the stream of God's desire for the world. I'm going to close with, and we've had lots of great images of especially water and gelassenheit. And when I was first reading about gelassenheit, it was a water image that came to me, something from a book that I've been reading called The River You Touch by a poet and river guide in Montana. He tells this story of leading a trip on a mountain river, and once they got several miles downstream, after fishing their way downriver and docked to camp for the night, someone in the party realized that they had forgotten something at the truck where they had launched, so in early evening they set out to hike back across a pasture to where they had parked. As it got darker and darker, and the writer, as the leader of the trip, became concerned about this person who hadn't come back, who had left camp, so he set out to go and intercept him on the way back and make sure he was okay. In getting there, though, they must have crossed paths because he couldn't find him, and now he was miles upriver, the river he had just floated, and trying to cut his way through the brush, find his way back to an opening so he could make his way back down to camp. And by this time it was nearly pitch dark. So every step, he describes, went out with the fear of stepping into a snake hole or a badger hole, of an unexpected encounter with an unsuspecting wild animal. Eventually, he decided he would have to get in the river. At first, just on the banks, because he figured he could, that would give him a little bit of an opening. But even there, he knew that the warm, exposed rocks in the cool evening would be the perfect spot for a coiled snake. So he knew he had to get all the way in the river, moving closer to the center until his ankles were lifted in the steady current, and he floated his way down the river until up ahead he could see the light of the fire and the rest of his party at camp waiting for his arrival. It's a dark and quiet Advent outside. There's probably good reason to be afraid on various fronts. Rather than fighting to hack our own path forward, in the way of gelassenheit, may we find our way to the center of the river, to let go and yield our own trying to the current that may carry us forward. Even in the darkness, there's light ahead. Christmas is coming. Amen.